Alright, what's up everyone? Shane, aka Wild Poker here, and after a long hiatus, we're finally back making another video, doing another hand history review, and actually this one's going to be a little bit more of a concept video, but it's good to be back, guys. I apologize for the long wait. I will tell you that for those of you that waited patiently, I'm still going to be putting out videos. Unfortunately, they're not going to be on a week-to-week basis like what I had originally planned for. It just turns out that I'm way too busy to make that happen, and there's from these videos I make zero money, so it's basically done on my free time to make these. And while I do enjoy it and I get something out of it in terms of learning, and I'm happy to kind of help support you guys that have been following me for a long time, whether it's on YouTube or when I used to stream on Twitch. It's just not going to be feasible to do every week, but I'm still going to be putting them out. So if you guys want hand history reviews, definitely hop on my Discord and keep sending me those hands, guys. So like I said, this hand is going to be it's touching on a concept that I'm working on in my own game currently, trying to adjust my bet sizes on some different textures where I think my standard has become just maybe a little bit lazy, and I'm looking to make a little bit more dynamic betting strategy in different situations. So the hand itself actually isn't all that exciting, really not much to go about it, but I think it'll get us started on the concept that I want to review, and then we're going to go into a bunch of pile sims to kind of really drive home the point just for that concept. We'll look at 3 different sims, and we'll go through to the turn on a bunch of them. This isn't really about getting us to the river with the best strategy, but it's about refining our flop strategy a little bit, and then seeing how we can carry that to the turn on a few different board textures, and some thoughts going into the turn. And that's what we'll do for today. So like I said, the hand, nothing super exciting going on here. We get a button open. We are a little bit deeper than 100 big blinds, so I could actually size up and make my 3-bet sizing here closer to 14 big blinds, something like that. I think that's becoming a little bit more standard with regs, especially as you get in between like the 110 to 140-ish range or 150-ish range even. Just putting a little bit more pressure on the in-position player, and you're still going to be 3-betting a nice linear, equity-driven range here. So it works well, but as long as we're putting in a decent size 3-bet, not making it too small, I still think we're going to be around the same EV, and actually it's probably not going to matter too much. And so I'm not going to nitpick my sizing too much here, but just wanted to point out that there are very, very strong regs out there who would definitely use a bigger sizing. And if you yourself are using a little bit bigger sizing here, there's no problem with that. We get to this flop here, and this is the concept that we're going to be working on. Is this, I think, definitely for myself and probably for a lot of you guys out there, this would be a board texture where as the 3-better, I would just default to a 1/3 c-bet sizing and actually c-bet a very, very high percent of my range. And I think for quite a while, the 1/3 sizing got very popular. One of the big reasons was because it's a very easy strategy to play. It's kind of hard to get punished when you're utilizing it. And, for a long time, the regs weren't really defending as much as a GTO simulator would suggest they would needed. So, maybe if you were playing against a perfect player, it might not have been the best strategy, but because people were folding too much and weren't raising you often enough to combat your small sizing, it actually probably made it better against a lot of players that you were playing against in your pools, for those of you that are using the 1/3 sizing. And I think now that so many people are studying with Pile Solver, and if they're not studying with Pile Solver, so many people are watching training videos and are constantly hearing about the 1/3 sizing and how to defend against it. I think a lot of regs and even recreational players are getting much better at defending against that 1/3 sizing, and are getting closer and closer to defending similar to how Pi would be. And to me, that means that I now need to look for a little bit better strategy than just, basically on any board texture outside of a couple, just c-betting 1/3 blindly. So this is a board that in the hand, as I played it, this is a strategy that I'm actually working on implementing myself, trying to figure out what board textures I want bigger sizings and what size I actually want to make it, what's the best sizing on some of these different board textures. And So at the time here, I kind of identified this as one that I think a bigger sizing with a pretty wide range was actually going to be quite nice. I still think on this board here, we do have the range advantage. I'm going to occasionally be 3-betting, some of the Jack-8 suited, although I think in the Sims I might not have put it. But against some players, I will have down to the Jack-8 suited, so I do have some of the 2 pairs. I'll definitely have pocket 8s. I'll definitely have pocket Jacks. I have all the overpairs, all the strong Ace Jacks, and, they're still going to have a nice wide range and not have Jacks 100% of the time and have very few of the overpairs. So still a board that's doing quite well for us in both terms of just our overall range being stronger than theirs, and we're still doing pretty well in terms of who has more of the really strong hand combos. So I do think, even if we're not c-betting 1/3, I still think we can c-bet here. A bigger sizing at a really high frequency, and I opted to go for 1/2 pot. And I actually marked this hand at the time because I wasn't sure if the 1/2 was actually the best sizing. I wanted to know, am I right? Is this a board that we do want to be betting bigger on? If we do want to be betting bigger on it, what size is actually best? Is half best? Is 2/3 best? And that's as big as I got. We're not at a sizing where I think we're needing, or a board texture where I think we need much bigger than 2/3. If we were deeper and maybe a little bit more connected board texture, we could make arguments for 3/4 or even pot on some textures. But I think here 2/3 is about as big as I'm ever going to want to go. So we're really going to look into that kind of idea and concept and kind of dig into that on this type of board texture for the video today. Just to finish off the hand, like I said, not too much going on here. We get the Jack of Spades. I think I could continue betting if I had, some of the spade combos in my hand, or even check call some of the time if I had a spade. But when I don't have that, I'm just checking and hoping to kind of get to showdown. He bets, and I just ended up folding, and that's the end of that hand. So not too much more to talk about there. Let's now get into the Sims here. So I guess I'll give you guys a second before I pull it up. Think about what your strategy should be. Do you think the 1/3 sizing is going to be best on that board texture? And, with what percent of your range? Do you think half sizing is going to be best? Do you think bigger is going to be better? And kind of think about what your strategy would be on that flop before I pull it up here, because we're going to show it in just 1 second, just to see if you can, check or guess your own thoughts about this type of board texture. One more time, pause the video, but other than that, we're getting into it. And boom. Okay, actually, before we jump into this, real quick here, you can see, like I said, I put in a bunch of different sizings. Really wanted to have a lot of options for this just to make sure we had a nice, robust, game tree, so that we could really check ourselves here. For our range, okay, I didn't put the Jack-8s. Against some guys, I will have it. This isn't actually necessarily my, standard 3-betting range. I just kind of picked something that I think would be maybe the average against a lot of the regs that I'm playing against, and is actually kind of a little bit representative of what I see the regs on Party Poker playing so far. So maybe this would line up similarly to a range that you're using, so it'd be kind of nice for you guys. What I'll say is, against maybe some of the guys that fold a little bit more often, I'm definitely going to be adding in this row of hands, and then obviously, bumping these up to a higher percent, and maybe, adding in these things down here as well. Against guys that are defending a little bit more aggressively and playing really well in position, defending really well with 4 bets, and also, when they call, they're playing really well post flop. I'm probably actually not even going to worry about having the 2s or the 3s. Realistically, like, having that extra board coverage isn't that big of a deal. The times where the fact that you can have 2s or 3s on a flop is going to be important is such a small frequency of flops. It's not that big of a deal. So I can actually just cut these out and stick more towards the bigger pairs, and you can even just deal with, these pairs if you want. And I would still want some frequency of all this stuff. I might cut out like the Ace-6 and the Ace-7 and, stick to the ones that can make the straights or some of the strongest Ace-6 suited. And, against the toughest guys, and maybe, like, let's say the big blind is a player that's cold four betting at a decent frequency and kind of making it tough to get away with 3-bets, I might decide to cut out, like maybe do these 50% of the time as well, these two hands here. So, my 3-betting range overall gets somewhat dynamic, and it can, like I said, we can add in more hands depending on the lineup, and we can take out some hands also depending on the lineup. And as well, if the recreational player is the big blind, you're going to see a lot more calling actually coming from, a mixture of calling coming from these hands. Or if he's a complete absolute maniac, there's going to be some percent of calling from, our strongest hand as well. So mixing it up. I think this gives us a okay average, and probably isn't off. If it is off, it's not off enough to really make that much of a difference for what we're doing for today. So for the button range here, I looked at the range research in Hand to Note, and while these numbers and percents aren't perfectly accurate, this is kind of a representation for what I've seen so far from players on Party Poker in 3-bet pots, small blind versus button when we've gotten the showdown. So, I only have about 150,000 hands on the site at this point, and obviously, that specific situation where it's small blind versus button and it got the showdown is pretty rare, so it's not going to be perfect, but basically if it's, got some tick, it means that we've seen it get to showdown in this line, and if it's got a really low frequency, that means is showing up way, way less than the hands that have 100%, and so on and so forth, as you see 10, 25, 50, and yeah. So this is kind of the range that we're dealing with. And again, if it's not perfectly accurate for probably the player pool that you're playing against, I think that we've covered enough things here that it's really not going to make too big of a difference for the board texture that we're working with. So we should be okay. I guess the only thing that would make like a huge difference is if the players you're playing against are calling with Jack A off 100% of the time or 50% of the time. That's going to add a decent amount of combos at the top two pair. That could be a little bit of a problem. But that's the only thing. Okay, so let's get into the setup here. So as you can see, we're doing a lot of betting here if we're giving it the options of 1/3, 1/2, and 2/3. Doing a lot of betting, not much checking here, and really heavily favoring the 2/3. And you can see here, as far as equity goes, we've got a decent equity advantage, as was expected. Pretty decent EV advantage, as was expected as well. But this is a board texture where Pile really likes to use that big bet. And as far as the smaller bets goes, it looks like it's balancing those around the pocket jacks, which makes sense. It's going to block a very heavy portion of his calling range. And, obviously would like to put in money, but it's going to be hard to get to build a big pot if we just start throwing in big bets all the time. So, and obviously there's hands in our range here that are definitely totally happy to put in big bets, even if we don't have the jacks in our big bet sizing range. We got plenty of eye with those other ones. So it's balancing the small bets around the pocket jacks, and then using the jacks in there to protect the smaller pairs, and also using some small bets with the 8s and the 5s, doing a lot of checking as well, and then mixing in a few bluffs with the small bets with the backdoors, but mostly favoring the big sizing. So we're not going to get too deep into this tree, because already looking at this, I'm getting the sense that in reality, we probably, if we cut out the half pot sizing, and maybe if we cut out the 1/3 sizing, just sticking to the 2/3 and, looking for textures similar to this, where instead of just defaulting to the 1/3, we now go to the 2/3 and just make sure we have a nice checking and betting strategy using only one sizing, I think would be probably much better for us than going for just the 1/3 with almost our whole range. And so we're not going to get too much deeper into this sim. What we're going to do is compare the 1/3 option and then the 2/3 option, because we do want to make sure that the 1/3 isn't viable, because there's sometimes where you'll see stuff like this, but then it's still 1/3 actually ends up being better. And you can already see here we're betting a very high percent of the time. And The main thing we want to check is our EV when we've limited our strategic options. So we're going from 12.119 to 11.882. And to me, that's a pretty significant drop off for reducing, for changing our strategy so much. So the first thing I'd want to check is this a board texture where players are going to be able to easily defend as much as Pio? Because that's one of the big reasons why the 1/3 became so popular, like I was talking about before, is people weren't raising as much as Pio and weren't calling as much as Pio. And because of that, it actually made it, against the average players you were playing against, it made it much better than this number here. And we were able to just do the 1/3 and not really worry about it. So let's say we bet and look to the turn here. So the first thing we're seeing is that they pretty much never have to raise against a 1/3 bet, as long as they're calling at a very high frequency. And I think the standard probably against the players, the standard definitely against the players that I play against is just to float here with a very, very wide range. I don't expect much raising. And so even if they're not trying to, as long as they're floating with a really wide range, they're going to be defending appropriately as Pio would. And so the next thing to check is, are they going to have a hard time calling with some of the hands that Pio calls with? And it looks like, so we're floating with all the ace-high backdoor flush draws. Let's do this to make it easier to see over here. And they can actually start folding some of their king-high backdoor flush draws. Some of these would end up getting folded, I think, by our competition. But as you can see, it's a very, very small part of the range. And it's really not that big of a deal to be folding these ones. When you have the king 4 and you have a backdoor trade as well, I think regs are going to get better at defending this. So far it's looking like these are all going to be pretty easy standard defends. Maybe a little bit extra folding here, but again, super small part of the range, if it's even in the range to begin with. So I think realistically, as far as this portion down here, all the ace highs and the king highs I think are going to be pretty easy defends. The king nines has a bunch of backdoor straights and the backdoor flushes. And when you look at the king 9 of diamonds, it's a break-even call. So even if they're folding it 100% of the time instead of the 20 or 10% of the time or whatever that is, that's not going to be too much of a difference. All these are pairs, gut shots or pairs or open and straight draws. An overcard with backdoor straights. I mean, when you're looking at this board texture, it just seems like everything that they have is a pretty easy float versus a 1/3 sizing. This has the... Well, this one's a little bit interesting in that it likes the ace of diamonds combos better than the ones with the backdoor flush draws. I would say that's probably because it's unblocking our... when we're checking here. If we are doing the 1/3 strategy, when we're checking all the diamond combos, betting all the weak backdoor flush ones, so when he doesn't block the backdoor flush ace, we're more likely to have, those weak ace X's. I think regs would probably do a decent job of at least defending this frequency of ace-10 offsuit. That's a pair. These are all pairs. Yeah, to me, it doesn't seem like they're going to have a hard time defending. And they're going to be pretty darn close without even really trying to doing what Pio is doing, which means, to me, I just don't think that this should be our strategy on this board unless we have, a read that they're overfolding on these flops. If you have the stats and you see that you're getting to, similar board textures and 3-up pots for this player, and they're folding to your 1/3 at, 20% of the time, or if they're folding 30% of the time, then you're almost printing money. But, if you have that read, you can probably just stick to the 1/3 strategy, not worry about it too much. But if you're against a strong, tough reg who's going to really try to defend appropriately and make sure to make your life tough, then I think we probably want to get away from the 1/3 strategy, because we can see here that we're just losing too much EV using that against that type of player. So that being said, let's move on to a strategy where we use only the 2/3 sizing. and see if we can simplify our life, make our life a little bit easier, and see if we can still get away with it, instead of having 3 different sizings and trying to balance between all of them. So we got the 2/3 sizing here, and the EV of this actually went up 0.011 or something like that. So 19230. So yeah, 0.011. That is probably just because when you look at the percent solved, we didn't solve these to completely perfect, so there could be a tiny bit of error built into that. That's my only real explanation for why we're seeing a slightly higher number here. But the good news is, whether there's a tiny bit of error or not, the number is incredibly close to the number we were seeing with the 3 different bet sizing options, which means that this is probably a pretty promising strategy where we can just, simplify our game and use a checker bet strategy and bet 2/3 on these type of board textures here when we're 3-betting, a range similar to this. Keep in mind, if your range is getting really wide or you're using a polarized strategy or something, then it's going to be different. But typically from the small blind, it's going to look something similar to this, and the calling ranges are probably going to be something similar to this. So in that kind of a setup, it's looking like this is going to be a good go-to strategy for us. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is just see what our strategy is, what kind of things we're going to be checking, and what we do when we check facing a bet of some kind, and what kind of things we're betting. And then we're going to look at a couple turns and see what our strategy looks like when we get to the turn, and see if we can't identify some patterns to kind of help us with that strategy and help us identify what the best move is as we're going forward. And we're just going to go through our check, see what happens when we check, and then we're going to go through a couple different turns, and that'll be the rest of the video. Okay, so first let's identify what we're betting, what we're checking, and I think it's going to be a pretty easy strategy for us to implement. You're going to see that there's going to be a lot of checking without the backdoor flush draw for our weakest aces. Here we have a pair with the 5, so we get to bet that. No backdoor flush draw, no backdoor flush draw. Here a pair again, no backdoor flush draw, no backdoor flush draw. Once we get to the ace-jack, we got top pair. Ace-queen, we now have 2 overs, the strongest backdoor straight draw. So, whether or not we have a backdoor flush draw isn't really that important. We get to be betting those at a high frequency. And down here with our weak pairs, if we did 3-bet those, it looks like we could just easily check them 100% of the time. Not worry about it too much. Checking pocket 5s here. Pretty much always checking pocket jacks here, betting pocket 8s a little bit more. And this does make sense if you think about it, is that pocket jacks, if you have pocket jacks, you want to check it a lot because you're blocking a very, very high percent of their continuing range with the top pair. And so you're hoping to either give them a chance to bluff or to give them a chance to put in a protection bet with a weaker pair, or if it goes check for them to, turn a couple extra percent of equity to feel like they need to continue in the pot, or start bluffing the pot down the road. When you have pocket 8s, now you're not blocking a lot of their jack X, so betting is more exciting, and they can have a hand super strong like pocket 5s, where now your pocket 8s is really fist pumping to get it, to try to build a pot against a hand like pocket 5s as well. When you have pocket 5s, they can occasionally have the pocket 8, so it's a little bit less exciting. But I mean, obviously that's not you're never not getting it all in with pocket 5s. Like, obviously that's not the main reason we're checking. And then obviously we're just checking because we want to give them a chance to bet, any weaker hands for value, and also bluff a bunch for us. But so hopefully that makes sense as far as, a way to identify, what sets we want to be betting. And then with everything else, we're just mixing. Well, we're doing a very high frequency of betting with our Jack X. Makes sense. And less betting as the quality of the Jack gets weaker. A small fraction of betting with our weaker pairs, but just checking those. Our pairs below the Jack, small frequency, and then below the eights, just never bet them. And so as far as figuring out a frequency with like these ones that are pretty heavily mixed, it looks like if you just hit about 50%, flip a coin for all of these weak ace-x, you'll probably be hitting pretty close to the frequency that Pio's using. And for all of them, with the backdoor flush draw, betting is actually slightly higher EV than checking. But what happens if we bet 100%? We just end up betting too much. Weak hands, and Pio can take advantage of that. So the other thing is, if you went over 50% against a player, there's no way they're going to be able to know that you're c-betting these backdoors too much without a very big hand sample on you. So if you just, even wanted to tune it up to 75% for all these, you would probably be doing just fine. And here this is a pair, again, 50%, something like that for all these. Anything that has a really strong straight draw is obviously going to be bet at a high frequency. Obviously checking here as we're doing with all these other weaker pairs. Again, really strong straight draw, betting at a high frequency. Really strong gut shot, betting at a high frequency. So it's all pretty easy to do, and I think this is actually, now that we've simplified it to either bet or check, this is probably a pretty easy strategy for us to implement in our games on this kind of a board texture. So let's see what happens when we check. The in-position player should be hitting us with a small bet size at a very high, not a very, some frequency. And, that's coming from the fact that a lot of our checking range, other than, the couple very nutted hands that we checked, which is only a few combos of our checking range when you compare all of it, is reasonably weak. And so he can just try to get away with a really small bet and also get some value and protection with the hands in his range that want to get some value. And I'm not going to go over too much of the imposition strategy. I'll leave it up here for a second for you guys to look at it, and you can kind of pause it if you want to look at it. But the main focus is for us in the small blind for this video. So let's say he bets small and just make it easy. This is a board texture where we do see small bets a decent amount when we check. It might actually be a little bit more than this frequency, probably this stuff, and this stuff here is just getting funneled into this sizing a little bit more often. So our small pairs, there's a tiny amount of EV in it. Realistically, I wouldn't worry about continuing these versus the vast majority of the pool. They're just going to be, although I said that they're probably betting more than this number, like I said, more of the stronger hands are probably getting put down into the sizing. And in general, they're probably overall checking back more often than what Pio is. And so I would guess that the betting range overall is going to be stronger. So I wouldn't really worry about these. You can see, against someone who's bluffing appropriately, this is a negative to break-even call. This is basically a break-even call. With the fours, when you do have the backdoor straights, versus the 1/3, you could make an argument for starting a call with the pocket fours. And you can see here, just folding all of the combos that checked until we start having some backdoor straight and backdoor flush potential, and then, occasionally bluffing, occasionally calling with it. And then any pairs or any nice gut shots are wanting to call or do some check raising. As you can see, we're check raising a decent frequency built around the jacks, the 8s, and the 5s. And then finding also some check raises with just our jack X, our overpairs, and gut shots and backdoor straight draws, things that have a combination of both. And I would say that it's going to be pretty easy to identify which hands could maybe be considered a check raise candidate, which hands could maybe be considered a check call candidate. We're not going crazy and finding any sort of strange bluffs. We're continuing with something that has a pair that's connected to the board 100% of the time. We're continuing with something that has a gut shot on this board 100% of the time, mixing in some check raises and some check calls. And anything that has 2 overs is continuing, mixing in some check raises and check calls. I think when you're facing this bet, it's going to be pretty easy for you guys to identify which needs to continue. I would just say that most likely, if we are checking, one, we need to probably make sure that we're checking these type of hands a little bit more often than likely we are. And we need to make sure that we're finding that check raise probably a little bit more often than we likely are. And that is going to be just making us tougher to play against, even after simplifying our flop strategy already. Okay, so now let's say we bet. Again, we've already identified that, on this board texture, even, versus the 1/3 sizing, we're not getting raised very often, versus the 2/3 sizing, we definitely shouldn't be getting raised very often. And here we can see, obviously, because we're betting bigger, he's allowed to fold much more. And I think actually at this sizing, we'll probably see the king 10s fold some of the time when we get up to this sizing, even with the backdoor flush draw. Probably the ace 7s will be folding some of the time, even with a backdoor flush draw. I don't expect any of the 8x hands to fold. Maybe pocket 6s might fold here. If he has 6-4, that's a gut shot. I don't think that's going to fold to 1-bet. So, I mean, the continuing range is probably going to be pretty darn close to this. Maybe just a smidge tighter, but likely pretty close. And so we can get to the turn. And what we're going to do is, the first thing, as I've been doing more and more, is kind of just getting a general feel for what our strategy is going to look like. And you can see here I gave us a bunch of different bet sizing options. What we're going to do is kind of try to identify a couple board textures or a couple turns and see, think about how that turn and similar turns is going to change our equity. And then we're just going to pick the bet sizing that's used more often and kind of see if we can build a strategy around that sizing or maybe 2 sizings. We're not going to try to use 4 sizings on every single different turn. Again, that's just going to make it way too difficult for us to balance. So for me, although I give us all these different options, what you can see is there's some turns, where this color is darker, where it really prefers 1 sizing or a bigger sizing or a smaller size. Some turns are going to want smaller sizings. Some turns are going to want bigger sizings. So you give it all the options so that it can cover all the different turns, but then you figure out where you want to use smaller, where you want to use bigger, and you simplify that strategy when you get to it. So we can see that the ace and the kings, ace X and king X is just a really, really good turn for us, and we're going to be betting almost 100% of our range on both of those at some sizing. The next most frequently bet is looking like the queen X along with 5X, and then 2, 3, and 4, and then all these middling kind of cards in here are going to be the highest frequency checks, it seems. So as kind of a general strategy, we can kind of see how things are forming here. And next, what I'm going to do is pick the card that has the highest EV for us, the ace, and we're going to look at our strategy, and that's going to kind of help us identify our strategy for this portion, for all the ace and the king turns here. And then I'm going to pick one that's probably the closest to exactly 50%. So it's looking like the 2 of diamonds here. And so that'll actually be a really good representation for, I mean, really just pretty much all these textures here and the queen. And then the next I'm going to pick, because it was on our board texture, we'll pick the Jack of Spades. That's the one that actually hit on the turn, so we'll look at that for a second. And then I'll actually kind of do good for, you know, roughly this stuff in here, and the 6x, and the 8x as well, all kind of close-ish equities. And then we'll look at our worst equity, which is going to be the 9 of diamonds. And the 9, that's going to represent, you know, the 9x, the 7x, and to some extent the 10x. The 10x is going to be kind of in between, but it'll be close enough. So we'll check out those turns and kind of look at what our strategy is on those different turns. So the first one, the Ace of Diamonds, as we saw here, we're trying to bet basically 100% of our range. And you can see here the biggest option that I gave, which was a full pot sizing, which you're not going to need when you're playing roughly 100 big blinds deep and you're betting 2/3 on the turn. You're just not going to need to implement a pot sizing. That was more for if we ended up using the 1/3 strategy on the flop. So we can just cut that out and not worry about it. And it's looking like there's actually a decent mix between the 1/3, the half pot, and the 2/3 pot, but really just heavily favoring the 1/2. And what we're probably going to end up seeing is, I mean, for all these hands that are being bet and being mixed, it's looking like the half pot is the highest EV for the most part. I'm sure there's probably one in here somewhere that we can find that might end up being a little bit lower. But really, I mean, I haven't seen one yet. So what I would end up doing, looking at this type of thing, is just saying, okay, you know, Pio really likes the half pot. It turns out that half pot is actually the higher EV bet size anyways. So let's just, on these ace and king turns, just bet half pot with our entire range. And we're going to be making, you know, implementing a really nice, easy strategy. And again, this is going to be very, very similar for the King X. And that's pretty cool when you can make things nice and easy like that. One of the reasons that we're able to bet such a high percent of our range is because our equity actually went up. So I think we were at about 53% on the flop versus 47. Now we're at 59 versus 41. So, you know, a nice equity advantage and still a very strong nut hand advantage as well. Getting to the turn here. The 2 of diamonds, as we saw earlier, a very even equity hand. So now equities are getting pretty close, which means that we actually want to be slowing down and finding a lot more checks in our range, which makes sense. When we don't have that equity advantage, we can't be pushing the action with a lot of bets. And because we're checking a lot, it means when we are betting, our range is actually going to be stronger overall, which means that we're actually going to want to use a bigger bet sizing. Even though the equities are the same overall, we're now betting a stronger range. We want to pick up a little bit bigger bet sizing. And so we're going to be sticking to a 2/3 on a kind of even equity turn card. And had we bet the jacks or the 8s for that small portion that we were betting those, we're now checking on the turn here. So we're still willing to play it somewhat slow with our kind of absolute nut hands, which I think both of these are, because he can pretty much never have jacks. And we're choosing, you know, needing a lot of value and protection from our overpairs that don't contain an ace, because as we saw before, he's calling us with a lot of ace-x. So our hands that don't have an ace, that have a pair, you know, really are favoring some protection, especially when we can beat a jack-x that's in his range. So king and queen are going to be kind of what our value range is built around, is the kings and the queens. Obviously, king and queen is our kind of weakest no-pair hand. You know, I guess we have some of the gut shots and things like this, but this just has the 2 overs, Can't really make a nutted hand, but still lines up really nice with our kings and our queens. And, still does have 2 overs, so some of the time we'll make an okay hand as well. So you see these are being bet at a pretty decent frequency. Obviously, we've still got top pair with these hands. Ace-king is actually starting to be checked at a high frequency here, which might be a little counterintuitive, because I think, people just kind of tend to always keep betting their ace-kings because they're always betting their pocket aces, pocket kings. And, similar to the reason we were betting our king-queen is because it lines up with our kings and our queens. The ace-king lines up with our aces and our kings. But here, this hand is actually kind of similar strength to, our 6-5s and 5-4s, where you can see the equity here of the check's 10. So it's actually valuing these quite a bit more. But roughly, I mean, versus their overall range that's getting to the turn here, I would put these in a similar category, even though, we have a pair here, and, when these hands make 2 pair, they're definitely more likely to be ahead than when we make a 1 pair hand here. So obviously these are getting a little bit more value, but overall, kind of that same category. Still has some showdown value and can still improve. This hand has much less showdown value, can get weaker or better hands to fold in the ace-x that floated, and can also still, improve a little bit. So hopefully that makes sense as to why we're wanting to actually do quite a bit of checking with our ace-kings. The ace-queen, let's see, we do check here. And we'll just pick the most commonly used sizing. Basically we're just giving up with the ace-queen is what's happening here. If it gets check-check, we're super happy, and that's going to happen some of the time. But the ace-queen, we're pretty much done with. And the ace-kings, I would leave it up to, depending on the player type that you're up against. There are some guys that are going to keep in mind that, one, we are betting a larger sizing here, so if we expect them to be folding tighter and then playing straightforward on the turn, I think our ace-king actually falls into a check fold as well. If we expect them to be defending really wide, like Pio, and then also betting as aggressively as Pio is doing, then the ace-kings actually fall into some check raising all in, and mostly just check calling. But you can see here, folding is also done even against Pio some of the time, whereas these are never folded. To point that out as well. Okay, so what are we betting 2/3 here? Everything that turned to gut shot is obviously going to be just an easy continue to barrel. Starting to do more checking here with the 5x, as I pointed out earlier. These here didn't really turn any extra equity, so we're more than happy to just kind of give up with those. Our 8x is still strong enough here to continue betting. Gut shot, doing some checking with top pairs here. The weakest top pairs, doing a lot more betting with the strongest. Checking the ace-jack here. Let's see what happens when we... Alright, so he is bluffing at a decent frequency with this hand, with this ace-x, this ace-x. But more of the bets coming here from the king-10. If he has the king-9. I'm doing quite a bit more checking back with these ace-x. Okay, so one of the reasons that we are checking the ace-jacks a little more than the king-jacks, one is protection, but if we have the ace-jack, we did see him doing some bluffing with some of his ace-x that floated. We saw his ace-7s bluffing at a decent frequency, but more of it's going to come from, there's still going to be a lot of his ace-x checking back. The ace-queens, the ace-10s, things like that are going to be checking back. So when we have the ace, we actually reduce his checking back frequency and kind of increase his betting frequency of the things like the king-10 and some of the other bluffs. And then obviously, he's still going to be betting a lot of the jack-x for us as well. So Pio here is choosing to actually check the ace-jack a little bit more than the king-jack because of how it changes his frequencies, where he's going to be betting for us a little bit more. So that's kind of a cool little feature where obviously ace jack has more value. Whether it's bet or checked, it's going to have more value because it's a very strong jack X. But opting to check it a little bit more because of how it interacts with, or how it changes his makeup of his range and how often he's going to bet for us. Okay, so I think we covered that pretty well. You guys can kind of see here what's continuing to bet and what's checking, and we just have already identified that we have a really easy strategy on these very neutral EV turn cards that we're just going to be betting 2/3 again. You know, strengthening our range a little bit, making sure we're not over bluffing, checking a lot of our middle pair type hands, slowing down here with our ace queens and our ace kings, but still applying a good amount of pressure. Okay, so the next one is the one that actually showed up in the hand, the jack of spades, and this is the first one where we're actually dipping under 50%. And as you can expect, as we get closer to 50%, neutral EV, our betting frequency gets less and less, and as we dip under 50%, then our betting frequency gets really low. And against overly aggressive players, you can exploitatively just always check 100% on these type of turns where it's as long as you know that they're aware that they're going to be at an EV advantage on the turn, and they're going to be really trying to exploit that by betting super aggressively. There are arguments for just checking your whole range and just check calling down at that point. But in the pile world, we're going to be countering that range discrepancy by just using the smaller bet sizings and not using any of the bigger bet sizings, and also just checking at a very, very high frequency. Again here, we're checking so much of our range, keeping it protected by checking jacks, eights, and if we have fives here, checking the fives. Doing a lot more checking with our ace jack, starting to be checking our king jack at a really high frequency, but wanting to continue to bet with our queen jack, our jack 10, and doing some frequency of betting with our kings, queens. Similar frequencies with the ace king, just giving up with the ace queen. So as far as what bet sizing to use, I would say that, again, when you look through all these hands here at the EVs, you can see that the highest EV bet size is the half pot as we go across all of these. And so the easiest thing to do would just be to do all of your betting at a half pot. Obviously, if you're betting only at 1/2 pot, you can put some of these up into here, but your checking frequency is going to increase a little bit. So you'll probably end up checking something like 68, 69% of the time. And then the rest of the time be betting half pot. Yeah, we already kind of talked about what's betting and what's checking. Focusing on, again, having nice equity. Starting to obviously check a lot of our one pair hands that are below the jack. Oh, one big note here that's a big takeaway is the king queens are also giving up quite a bit, doing much more checking with those, because obviously if we're checking at a higher frequency, then that means our bluffs are going to go way down as well. So keeping in mind here that this frequency is reduced significantly. So when we do check, betting about 50-50 here. We did check a lot of our ace jacks for this reason to kind of come in with a check raise, and our bluffs are coming from the open-ended straight draw here, the open-ended straight draw here, the really strong gut shots, occasionally going for a check raise with queens or aces, always want to check raise the kings it seems, or almost always. Again, pretty much just giving up with the ace queen unless we have the flush draw or a spade here in our hand. But even with the one spade, against tighter players, we could even just give up with those ones and only continue with the spades. The reason the diamonds are continuing here, the ace queen of diamonds, is because it actually unblocks any of his bluffs that are going to get here, because as you can see, when we bet this size, he only floated with backdoor flush draws, which means if we have the ace queen of diamonds, we don't block any of those club or heart combos that floated that might now be bluffing. So you do see the diamond combo also wanting to continue, but again, we need a pretty aggressive betting strategy from our opponent for that to be the case that we want to try to call. Some calling with the ace kings and occasionally actually going for the check raise bluff. Keeping in mind here that we're not check raising all in, we're doing a 2.8x check raise. So putting in a significant portion of our stack, but there's actually going to be a case where, you know, we do check raise and we actually fold some of the time. If we're playing a nice balanced strategy, obviously calling the vast majority of the time, but can still find folds. Okay, so I think we covered the Jack of Spades pretty well. And the last one is the Nine of Diamonds, which was basically the absolute worst for us. And as you can expect, as our equity gets lower and lower, more and more checking. Here, this is a little bit interesting because we saw almost no bet sizing at this. At the 2/3, it was all pretty much half or 1/3. And so I think what's happening, straights, we have 5 combos, 2.7 combos of a set. And we'll go over pair or better. So 21, 22, 23. We'll just say 24 combos, kind of rounding up. All right, we'll say 23.8, we'll be exact. 23.8 combos of relatively strong hands here, even though our equity dropped down drastically. Dear God. 39. Wow. So he's way ahead of both. My guess was the reason we could still use the bet sizing is that we were pretty close as far as the nut equity, meaning our straight combos were going to be close-ish. But he actually has all the queen 10 offs, which means that he's actually way ahead of his straight combos. So this is actually a little confusing to me why it's choosing to use the bigger sizing here when our nut advantage is just so low and our equity is so low. But it seems to me like it's just still going to push the hands that have decent equity against the overall range of our opponent, checking at a very high frequency with everything else. Let's see what happens when we do check. Obviously he gets to bet. With such a nut advantage and such equity advantage, I think some people would opt to use a, you know, really big bet sizing. I think here when the pot is already so big and, you know, you can easily get it all in with a small bet here and a, you know, medium-sized bet on the river. And because our advantage is so strong here, the opponent should just be check folding at such a high frequency. It's kind of using a small bet size to take advantage of it and betting at just a really high frequency here. And you can see here we're just folding a ton, choosing to obviously check raise our straights, doing some check raising of the king queen, blocking some of his nut straight combos to blend in with our queen 10s. Similarly with the queen jacks, has top pair and obviously outs to the nuts, and obviously blocks the opponent's nuts, which is kind of nice. Oh, and also keep in mind we're not check raising all in here. Again, we're check raising 2.8x, so if he does raise, there are some hands that will fold, but given the size of the pot, not going to happen very often. So, you know, our two pairs, pair plus straight draws, sets, straights, all going for the check raise, and then blending in some bluffs just to balance with it, and some top pairs for kind of protection, and bluffs because they are protected by, you know, our nut hands that are check raising here. So this would probably be an area where I think I might have a little bit of trouble. I might end up just check calling too much on the turn here and not getting close to this kind of a check raise frequency because, you know, I've always been aware of the fact that our equity drops even more when we check, which is obvious. I've always been aware that, you know, on these kind of turns, it's going to be much better for the imposition player. And so I didn't really think we would ever want to have such an aggressive check raise strategy as we see here. But one thing to keep in mind is that if you're up against Pio, they're betting a ton of weak things like pocket sixes are betting here. 6-5, 6-4, 5-4, you know, ace queens, ace kings, 7x, you know, betting at a really high frequency with really weak things. it makes sense that we want to try to pick up our aggression a little bit. So this is a, I'm not going to go too deep into this, but this is also somewhere where I could probably improve my strategy a little bit and get definitely a little bit tougher by implementing a few more check raises on the turn here, on these type of turns. So overall though, our strategy as far as betting goes, we looked mostly at checking already. Betting a lot of things that have reasonably high equity and balancing some things that block the like Queen X is going to be our most common bluff here. Blocking Queen 10 is pretty important. And then also doing a little bit of a similar thing with 6X, blocking 7-6. And the 5 is kind of a nice bonus because it blocks a set of 5s. Blocking Queen 10 makes sense to have this as a continued bet. And obviously have an open-ended straight draw ourselves, same reason. Want to be very careful with not over betting our only 4 combos of the Queen 10 that we can have. If we bet these 100% of the time, and then when we check, obviously it's going to be quite a bit easier for a good opponent to take advantage of us. So basically flipping a coin here with how often we're betting these ones. And yeah, the moral of the story is checking a lot. So slowing down on the turn quite a bit when we see them turn that equity advantage. And I think I kind of covered everything for this video that I wanted to cover. It's kind of hard to go really super in-depth into this type of stuff because we're only covering one board texture, and it would take hours and hours and hours to go through every turn and, you know, go through all the rivers and go through both players' perspectives. So I kind of had to cut a bunch of stuff out, but hopefully it gave you some stuff to think about for your own games, and maybe give you some spots where you can adjust some of your strategies. And also, if you guys do have any questions or wanted to see something specific in a little bit more detail or learn a little bit more about it, you guys can always ask questions in the comment section of this video, or hop in my Discord and ask questions there as well. And I'll definitely do my best to give you guys a good answer and kind of update things as we go. So hopefully you guys enjoyed it. And until next time, good luck at the tables, everyone. Take it easy.